On behalf of Roli Books, I invite you on this special program, which is Roli Pulse. My name is Hilal Ahmed, and I'm from Center for the Study of Developing Societies. And we are going to discuss a very interesting and important book today, which is recently published by Roli Books. It's My Life and Struggle, the autobiography of Abdul Ghaffar Khan, the Frontier Gandhi. This is an interesting book for all of us, not merely because this is the second English translation which has just come out, but there is an interesting story of the book. I'll come to this story later, but before that, I would like to introduce my guest today. We have Imtiaz Ahmad Sahibzada, a former civil servant, and I have a long biodata in front of me, which I'm not going to read out, but he was a senior civil service official in Pakistan. Beside being a senior officer, he was closely associated with Ghani Khan, one of Ghaffar Khan's son, and he also translated Ghani Khan's poem. And he is actually translated the version of the book, which is this one, the Frontier Gandhi, very recently. And this is the book on which this discussion is all about. We also have Professor Raj Mohan Gandhi with us, journalist, author of over a dozen books, including Mohandas, A True Story of a Man, His People and an Empire, and Rajaji, A Life. He had led the Indian delegation to UN Human Rights Commission in 1990. Until 2012, he taught political science and history at the University of Illinois. Since then, he has spelled as scholar in residence at IIT Gandhinagar. We also have with us Professor Mukulika Banerjee. She is a reader in anthropology at University College London, and she's the author of a, I would say, classic, the Pathan Unarmed, A Position and Memory in Northwest Frontier, and co-author of the book called Sari. This is something which is, very brief introduction to our guest. But what I would like to emphasize here before we start is that all three speakers have got some kind of a personal connection with the book and the making of the book. Imtiaz Sahab, as I said, that he was very close to Mr. Ghani Khan. And if you read the book, you find that the translator's note is full of, I would say, a personal connect, which is reflected throughout, not merely in the note, but also throughout the book. And when you read the book, you realize that as if Badshah Khan is speaking to you. And that's the beauty of translation, which I really enjoyed as a reader. So this is the personal touch which Imtiaz Sahab had. Rajmohan ji met Bacha Khan Sahab in person, and also, in fact, he wrote an excellent biography of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. So which makes us quite curious to look at how, as a biographer, as a co-traveler in some respect with Bacha Khan, and as a reader of this biography, autobiography, how would he think? And that's the personal touch. Professor Mukulika Banerjee, in my view, she actually reinvented the everyday life of Khudai Khidmatgar movement through the prism of those who actually participated in the movement. And her book, that's a remarkable book, which opened up a lot of new questions. And in fact, I must confess that I read this translation of autobiography through the prism of Mukulika ji's earlier work on Pathan. So she also had a personal touch of a different kind, reinventing the afterlife of a movement, and that too through the people who actually participated, makes her intervention quite significant and relevant. And I'm hoping that she would bring out some interesting stories as well as some critical points about the movement as well. So before I invite Imtiaz Sahab, I would like to say a few things about the story of the book. this is an autobiography, but autobiography of a different kind. We all agree because I think the foreword, which is written by Rajmohan ji, has got a question mark as well about the story of the book. So, but in the book, if we look at the translated version which we have at the moment, I think that question which he raises answered at the end of in the final chapter where Bacha Khan is addressing his readers. The story is quite like this, that in 1965, Badshah Khan narrated his life story to someone called K.B. Narang, and that too in Pashto. And Narang Sahab actually compiled that and produced some kind of a book. And this life story, as an autobiography, was published simultaneously in Urdu as well as in English. So we have three versions. First, the Pashto version, then the English version, which was published simultaneously with the Pashto version, I think in 1969. And if I'm not wrong, Mukulika ji, you used Pashto version and Urdu version as well as English version in your work extensively. So we have all these three versions, but what we realize in this book, the translated version which we have at the moment, we are told by the translator that Badshah Khan felt that this story is inadequate. So he decided to write with the help of others and compiled a new version. And that version was also published in 1983, again in Pashto. The present is actually the translation of the version of 1983 book, the autobiography. Now, this sequence is very interesting because, in my view, it is writing over writing. First of all, author as a narrator, and he narrates the book. He narrates a few selective events of his life to someone and asks him to compile. Then author becomes a reader. He reads that compilation and as a dissatisfied reader thinks that there is spaces here which need to be filled up. And then he reworks as author again and produce an updated version. Now, final point is about that in this version, the author asks the reader and the people with whom he was associated at at one point of his life, invites them to recorrect him. So there is an invitation for all of us to read the message and to recorrect where Bacha Khan feels that he is not sufficiently explained his own life story. So it's a democratic way in which reader-author things get intermingled. What is interesting to us is that, and I think Rajmohanji also pointed out in his introduction, in his foreword, that we have to remember the content of this story. This story begins with the early life of Badshah Khan and finishes at the partition of India. Now, why he was so keen to focus entirely that moment when India was divided? And this is something, a message for all of us, I suppose. And I would like all of you to respond to that question. For me, I think there is a suggestion, and there is a 20th chapter of the book where Badshah Khan says that, and there is a coded message, I would say. He wants us to extract a few quotes, messages, and meanings from his story to make sense of our contemporary. And this is something, the challenge for all of us. So, as I said, that's I'm looking forward to hear more from you. This is what I think as a reader and as a person who is actually outside. So what I'm going to do now to invite Mr. Imtiaz Ahmad Sahibzada to say something about the story of the book and his experience of translating the book. Here. So Imtiaz Sahib, over to you.
Well, the book, as I've said in the dedication, was undertaken at the behest of Shandana, who made a special request for it to be translated into Pashto. It took me a year and a half to comply with her request And then it took another year or so for it to be edited by her and the others. Now, having said that, I want to set the stage for your discussions later, and that is to discuss the role of Bacha Khan, uh, the achievements of Bacha Khan in various spheres, and also the legacy that he has left to the Pukhtuns. Now, if you read the last chapter of the book, which is the epilogue, you will find that you can divide Bacha Khan's life into three separate components, as it were. One is that relating to him as a reformer, the reformation of society. The second one is uh, his role as a leader and the founder of the Khudai Khidmatgar. And the third one is his role as an educationist. Now, beginning with the first, uh, as a reformer, he established the Anjumani Islahe Afagina, which means the Committee for the Reform of the Afghan society. Now, in that, he focused on a number of things. The most important of which was to whittle down the differences between different segments or classes of the Pukhtuns. The Pukhtuns over the years here in Pakistan Pukhtunkhwa, their system had become almost as rigid as the caste system in India. The racially Afghan people, they were the landowning class, and agriculture was the mainstay. All the others were those who assisted in the agrarian society and were paid in kind at the end of each harvest. They included many kinds of people. They included the potters, they included the ironsmiths, and so on down the line, the carpenters and the gardeners, and so on, in a huge, but they were very rigid. When he established the Khudai Khidmatgar movement, made it a point to include as many of these non-Pukhtuns or landowners as was possible in the cadres of the Khudai Khidmatgar. And he thus gave them a lot of respect and a lot of authority in that organization, which the others obviously resented a bit. He was also bent on the emancipation and the empowerment of women at that time and advocated education for the girls and advocated that they should get their full rights as Islam had conferred upon them, including the rights to hold property and inherit property from their fathers. Now, as far as the education aspect is concerned, or his role as an educationist, he founded the Azad School or the free school in his village, and then spread the movement to the other parts of the other districts and the province. Unfortunately, the British opposed this, and hence he was not able to make as much progress in this as he could. But when the Khudai Khidmatgar governments were formed, he made it a point to allocate as much resources as possible those days to further the cause of education in the province. Now, his role as a politician or as a political leader is well known, but he established the Khudai Khidmatgar movement for this, and the aim of the Khudai Khidmatgars was to free colonial India from the rule of the colonialists and give them self-government and independence. Now, as far as his legacy to the Pukhtuns are concerned, you can say that he brought in political consciousness both amongst the men and the women. Number three is that he was successful in the movement in as much as India did gain freedom from the British, but it was a partitioned India. So to the extent that India gained freedom, he was successful. To the extent that it was partitioned, he was a failure today. And the Holocaust that followed, it pained him a great deal, and he never forgot it. Why India was partitioned, you people know very well. It was over the opposition of Bacha Khan, but unfortunately, circumstances so developed that Gandhiji, Nehru, and Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel ultimately agreed and to the Mountbatten Plan, which was a partition of India along religious lines. He was against the referendum in the frontier. And he was against that referendum for the reason, number one, the Khudai Khidmatgars felt that since the Congress had abandoned him, if there were these two options, either India or Pakistan, then he could not cast the vote in favor of India because they had already abandoned him. As far as Pakistan was concerned, he said that there should be a third option included, and that was Pukhtunistan. What he meant by Pukhtunistan is a different story. But since they did not include these, they boycotted the referendum, and the result was obvious to everybody. Now, this is, as I see it, in very brief, for a further discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Imtiaz Sahab. You really set out a stage for further discussion, and I'll definitely come in the next segment to ask a few questions about these three very interesting and important division of life which you describe in relation to legacy of Badshah Khan. Now, I would like to invite Professor Gandhi to make his initial remarks.
Thank you. I feel that this publication of this book at this juncture is very timely because of the kind of world we are now living in 2021. And I think it's important for people, young people of our time, also to get a flavor of kind of revolution that Badshah Khan had created. And I want to start by giving a flavor of this through a story that Ghani Khan has related elsewhere. Ghani Khan spoke, the eldest son of Bacha Khan. There was a Colonel R.N. Bacon. He was a British military officer, was also a political officer in the frontier region. And Bacon said this to Ghani Khan, and Ghani Khan relates this, referring to the nonviolent defiance of 1930 of the Khudai Khidmatgars. So this is what Bacon said. Ghani, I was the assistant commissioner in Charsadda. The red shirts, that is how the Khudai Khidmatgars were also known, the red shirts would be brought to me. I had orders from above to give them each 2 years rigorous imprisonment. I would say, are you a red shirt? They would say, yes. Do you want freedom? They would say, yes, I want freedom. If I release you, will you do it again? Yes, they said. So Bacon then said, I wanted to get up and hug these individuals. Instead, I would write 2 years. So this is the impact. Now, this phase when the autobiography appears is a time when large sections across the world have altered their norms and their goals. They question democracy, they question equality, they question the view that all of us belong to a common humanity. Supremacy of the dominant is the new slogan, whether or not openly proclaimed. America belongs to the whites, India belongs to the Hindus, and so forth and so forth. So this is what makes this book timely. Now, as we all know, this book does not cover Badshah Khan's life after 1947. Those were 41 important years, many of them spent in prison or exile. The book is also mostly silent about his deep feelings for his family. Of course, the story that is told is gripping and terribly relevant. Now, if you want a model of frank speech, you can recall Bacha Khan's remark. This is not in the book because this is post-47, but we all know of this, of course. He was in India in 1969. He came from Afghanistan where he was in exile. And he spoke to India's parliament, both houses of parliament, in 1969. And this is what he told India's ministers and MPs. Your laws are only for show. You are forgetting Gandhi the way you forgot the Buddha. This is what Badshah Khan says to the ministers, members of parliament of India in 1969. I want to mention something else at that time. On that visit, I had the chance to meet him on that visit when he was in Wardha. And here I'm reading from my account in my biography. So in Wardha, a tray of tea was brought to him just after a barber had cut his hair. Badshah Khan, I saw this. Badshah Khan prepared a cup and asked that it be given to the barber. And then in a speech in Wardha, he said, last night I heard on the radio that I had left Ahmedabad, that great welcomes were given to me on my journey, that people garlanded me on my arrival in Wardha, but the radio did not say what I said. So he was candidly speaking across India, very candidly about what was happening. Also about the great violence perpetrated against many Muslims in many parts of India. Bacha Khan spoke very frankly about it, but he was complaining that the Indian media was not reporting this. So to give you an idea of his candor. Now, for our times today, when many people all over the world, including in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, have to face the possibility of tragedy, of death, here is how Badshah Khan once said, if I die, I will be with God. If I live, God will be with me. So as I studied his life, and I still reflect upon his life, I feel this about Badshah Khan. He spent so many years in prison, lonely years. He was free behind bars. He was a general without a gun. He was a king minus a throne. He loved his family deeply, but he seldom spoke of his love for his family. He loved human company, but was fated to spend year upon year in lonely confinement. He satisfied his longing for human affection by pouring out his affection for others. And we know that with his life and struggle, he changed for millions the image of the Pathan, of the Pukhtun. After him and after the Khudai Khidmatgars, the Pushtun became someone who protected the weak, who was kind, who was helpful. And of course, above all, Bacha Khan showed that Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, and Christians can live in mutual friendship and mutual respect. He showed that bullying, domination, cruelty by one side over the other was not only disgraceful, it was avoidable. People can live as friends, people can live as good neighbors. As the autobiography reveals, Bacha Khan knew and loved many parts of India. We know he loved his Pukhtuns and cared for all the people of Pakistan. In fulfillment of his wish, he was buried in Jalalabad in Afghanistan. He belongs to all three countries and to more than these three. So I rejoice that we're having this conversation. And I rejoice that a distinguished Pakistani is brought as a result of this conversation to Indian audiences. Our region has problems, deep problems, but our links also go very deep. We have inspiring examples and we can dare to hope. I'll stop with that.
Thank you very much, Rajmohan, for very illuminating and very enlightening comments. I'll come to the idea of contemporary later on, and especially the point you raised about why he stopped in 1947, why not later. I think these 2 points are related to each other. I'll ask a few questions about it, but let me now invite Professor Mukulika Banerjee to make her initial remarks. Over to you.
Thank you, Hilal. What an honor this is to be speaking with two such distinguished speakers, people who also had the opportunity to know Bacha Khan, to meet him. And of course, we have Rajmohanji's fantastic biography already for us to read. And now we have this incredible labor of love that Imtiaz Saab has done in his retirement of bringing to audiences now the full translation of Bacha Khan's original autobiography from Pashto into English. And the book really captures for me the tone, for somebody who has thought about this figure, for more than 30 years now. This book is such a treat because it has his tonality, it has its inexhaustible energy, his candor, his quite astute observations about people. You really get a sense of this person. So it's almost as if a very important part of our history, of our shared history, our shared inheritance of the freedom struggle, which with every generation seems to recede a little bit further into the past. We are beginning to approach it through 3, 4, 5 generations now, our struggle for independence, and it's getting more and more remote. And there is every danger that we might forget just how important it was and what extraordinary figures fought for that independence. And that's why we need to treasure what was created with independence. So this book coming out now in 2021, it's like a wake-up call. You read it and things that you thought were remote are made very immediate. And Bacha Khan's own account, there's lots one can say, and I hope we'll have a chance to pick up on some of the specific themes. But there are two aspects to his life, as to any great figure's life. There is the personal, and then there is Bacha Khan, the activist, the politician, the political leader, the mass leader that we all know him to be. It was unlike, unlike my co-panelists, I didn't even see Bacha Khan. I saw photographs of him in newspapers growing up in India. But it was his death that inspired my interest in how can you have a Pashtun, a Pathan who is nonviolent, a Muslim who clearly not only believed in civil disobedience, but persuaded thousands and thousands and thousands of other Pashtuns to adopt it as a political philosophy and as a political strategy. That's what got me interested. So when I went to Pakistan, it was really after Bacha Khan's death to see if there were any elderly revolutionaries, any elderly Khudai Khidmatgars around who could tell me what it was like to have Bacha Khan as their leader. And and after much searching, I found over 70 of them, very elderly men, who, very importantly, of course, had been silenced after 1947. They could not tell their story. The movement was banned. People went underground. So it was after 50 years that somebody had actually come asking them for their stories. And one man, one Khudai Khidmatgar, had actually managed to save his uniform. And just for the sake of our audience, I just want you to see what the Khudai Khidmatgars looked like. These were the red shirts. These were the surkposh uniforms that all Khudai Khidmatgars wore, which of course we see only through black and white photographs of the archives now. But one of these Khudai Khidmatgars had saved it, and he wore it for me. And even after all those years, the hold of this person, this leader, on their imagination was just enormous. And of course, they remembered him as a great prophetic figure, as a leader who inspired them to do something that they did not themselves know they were capable of, but also remembered him very intimately. I'd go to any village and people would say, "You see that little room there over on the side? That's where Bacha Khan used to sleep when he was traveling through the villages. If he came to our village, we used to give him that room." Or he swept these village lanes himself. Never mind, he was such a big Khan. He was a very humble person. So there were lots of anecdotes about him that continued to circulate. And you get a sense of that spirit in Bacha Khan's autobiography here, where he talks about cleaning toilets with Gandhiji, what it was like, and how people around the ashram, in fact, began to boycott them because they were considered to be unclean, what it was like to actually be a Gandhian, to be part of the national struggle, not just fighting against the British, but fighting against all kinds of prejudices within one's own society. And that is the message, I think, that continues to remain relevant. Just before I end, I want to say this in case we don't get around to talking about it later, Hilal, if I may, that I'm very struck uh, by what a feminist he sounds. Throughout the book, he talks about his two wives, they who both die very tragically. The first one uh, with the influenza pandemic. The second one had a terrible accident falling down the stairs when they were on their Hajj. Um, but he writes things like, "I loved my wife very much," which is extraordinary if you think about it. He writes about his children. He's a single father after all. He's worrying about Ghani and Wali and Ali and Mehtaj, his children, about their education, getting them into the right schools, how to manage them, calling them to Gandhi's ashram when he's there, finding them tutors. There is this fretting of a parent, but there is absolutely no distinction in his narrative between the women in his family and the men in his family. And it's very consistent. And it's an extraordinary message I think we should not forget in the sort of high politics of everything else, of course, that he's involved in. I do hope, I'll stop now, but I really hope we will talk about where his civil disobedience itself, Hilal, and the inspiration for it, but we can come to it because there are, I think, direct messages for the very contemporary that we are living in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mukulika ji, for your remarks. Obviously, we are going to have more on specific issues now. But before I go into that, I would first like to ask a few questions to Imtiaz Ahmad, which partly on his initial remarks and partly as a translator of Bacha Khan's autobiography. Uh, the first question is, which is again an important question. When you write an autobiography, you select events and you also select a beginning and an end. So the question which is posed by Rajmohan ji in his foreword, I'm just repeating it. Why you think that Badshah Khan stops? Because there are two other versions here. One version is 1965, published in 1969, another version in 1983. And in both the versions, he stick to the moment which we call partition. Why not later? So that's the first question. The second question, which is an open question, and I'll come back to this question later, and I'm very keen because when I read the book, this is something which Mukulika ji also underlined. I find an extraordinary ways in which religion is interpreted, especially Islam. And his journey, Hajj journey, is something which is very relevant. So, Imtiaz sir, when you talk about his legacy as a reformer, I think it would be better if you say something about his interpretation of Islam, that the specific form of Islam that is practiced there, and how he reinterpreted and reinvented Islam in order to mobilize and create not merely reform, but also something more, Khudai Khidmatgar. So these are the two very specific questions which I would like you to respond.
Well, as far as I know and I can see, Islam to him was a religion of peace. Islam to him was not a religion of antagonism to those who were non-Muslims. Islam to him was an emancipation of the women and not their enslavement as in the society of the time, at that time. Islam to him was a progressive movement of change in society, of the way society thought, lived, and worked. Islam to him was a composite whole. It could not be broken down into different segments. It had to be adopted as a whole and put in practice as a whole. And Islam to him was not sitting down on the prayer mat alone and praying, but Islam to him was above all a service to all humanity, irrespective of caste, creed, color, religion, and those distinctions. So, this was how he felt Islam was. He reinterpreted Islam and brought it into use by reinterpreting the popular words and instilled it into the consciousness of his Khudai Khidmatgars, that it meant service to humanity irrespective of caste, creed, or color. This is as I see him interpret the religion. Why did he restrict himself to 1947 as the end point of his autobiography? I, along with you, wish that he could have written some more during the years of Pakistan. But the only reference there is to that is that 2 or 3 sentences that after independence, I was put into jails more than I was in the pre-partition time. So why he stopped there, I just wouldn't know directly why he did that. But it is our loss that he stopped there. We can only conjecture about the rest of it. But his life after 1947, I've tried to briefly describe in that chapter called the Epilogue, of what he did and how he did it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I read that epilogue and I find that there are some interesting remarks which you made. But I think you are right that this is a puzzling question, and this is a question which actually forces us to think again as a reader, to revisit the beginning and the end and why he stops there. So now I move to Rajmohan ji, and this is the same question. Why do you think that he stops there? Because if we read the last chapter of the autobiography, which is on, I would call it betrayal, because he is very unhappy with many of the Congress leaders. And for him, this is a kind of betrayal which is actually giving us a signal that there is an unease, and whatsoever happened after 1947 is something which is part of the moment which led to that the later experiences of Badshah Khan. So that's the first question. Why do you think that he stops there? That's one. The second question, again, which is coming out from your very brief presentation, it's about contemporary. Why do you think that the religion, which is interpreted by Gandhi as a liberative force, which is interpreted by Bacha Khan as a force by which a people's oriented, what he also calls revolutionary meaning of religion can be extracted, is something which is actually losing that thing. And now what we have got in the name of religion is very dogmatic, it's very radical, and it is very professionally, ideologically oriented. Why do you think so, that this is what happened at the moment?
So I'll try to respond to the extent that I can. On your first question, I think it's very important to recognize one thing. It is not as if at the end of his life, Bacha Khan says to himself, I must now edit my earlier autobiography. I must now write a new autobiography. And he decides, I will write only about part 47. I will not write about. So I don't think we can quite reach that conclusion because we don't know. And we don't know the details of how this autobiography that Sahibzada Sahib has translated so wonderfully, how exactly it came to be, when it came to be, where it came to be. So are there handwritten notes by him about it? So it is perfectly possible to imagine that as and when he had some time, in between his imprisonments, in between his detentions in Pakistan, he was also in Afghanistan, as and when he had time, he felt that he should update what was already there. It isn't as if he said, कि जो बाद में हुआ उसके बारे में तो मैं नहीं लिखना चाहता हूँ. So he's not like, you might say, an author as we can imagine, who has a leisurely life, who then looks back on his life and decides what he will write and what he will not write. He had this book that was published, translated also in Urdu and in English. Then he had the time and he amplified it. He made it fuller. But so I'm not sure that we can conclude that he decides that he will only end the story with that. He just had no chance or opportunity. It's possible. I'm speculating. I don't know. I think one needs to have scholarly research into this, interviewing the people who are still there, Asfandiar Saab and others, very many relatives, to find out exactly what happened. So this is my. So I think, what you say is absolutely true, that the betrayal was a very big event in his life. It was a very big event in so many millions of people's lives, a big event in the subcontinent's life. It certainly influenced the future. But beyond that, we can't quite say about why he did not write about the latter part of his life, which was also, of course, a very, very. I just make one little point on Islam, if I may. I had the privilege when I last met him in '87, again to ask him about nonviolence and his deep commitment. So he said, he repeated with great emphasis that in his opinion, the word that occurs the most in the Holy Quran is patience. Patience. And he said to him, patience and nonviolence are one and the same thing. And he was absolutely, so he and as has been said many times, he drew his nonviolence from the Holy Quran. So he was very clear on that, and patience. Now, on your second question about today's world and why you might say the Hinduism of Gandhi or the Islam of Badshah Khan is not widely and passionately proclaimed by Muslims and Hindus today, that is a very, very important question. But I think that relates to the world as a whole. Look at the United States, where I'm sitting at the moment. Look at the number of Christian clerics who are supporting Trumpism, which almost, and also supporting throwback to the Confederacy and some kind of opposition to a multiracial United States. So where is Christianity today? Where is Islam today? Where is Hinduism today? I think the question, Buddhism, I mean, look at what's happening in Sri Lanka, in many other, Burma, where is Buddhism today? So, not to mention China and Tibet and so forth. So these are great questions for the world as a whole. But I think we have to, one last thing I will say here. We imagine that what happened in 47, 48 in India after tragedy of partition, that it was somehow natural, automatic. We forget that in 1947, after partition was, you might say, accepted by everybody, some with great sadness, others with some enthusiasm on both sides. There was such a plan even at that stage to turn India into a Hindu Rashtra in 47, 48. And for us to imagine that India almost naturally, automatically chose to become a secular state or a pluralist state for everybody, that India belonged to everybody, Muslims, Christians, Hindus, that was not at all inevitable. It was not automatic. There was a tremendous fight put up by Gandhi, by Nehru, by a great many others. And that is how India walked the path of democracy and of equality, pluralism and secularism. It didn't happen automatically. There was great courage involved. And so today in the world, and there are, we all know, so many individuals who are today fighting, for the right Islam, for the right Christianity, for the right Hinduism. And they may seem outnumbered today, but we need not underestimate them. So, but beyond that, I can't answer why our world is the way it is.
Now I move to Mukulika ji, and as I said that I would like to ask you two very specific questions. The first question is, because as a researcher, you spend a lot of time there. And if I read this autobiography through your work, one very obvious question that emerges is on the question of Muslim politics in South Asia. Khudai Khidmatgar underlines a very specific form of politics, which is by all standard a successful politics in its own right. They were there, and if we read the last few chapters of autobiography, Bacha Khan is also asserting the fact that, look, we were successful at one point of time. Now that successful, if we compare that successful, and I'm emphasizing on this idea of success, not because I think that Surkh Poshak was a successful movement in the conventional sense of a success of a movement. Rather, I am emphasizing the fact that they were able to create an impact in terms of impact. success in terms of impact. Now, if you compare the Muslim politics outside of Northwest Frontier province there and then later, you do not find the experiments which Badshah Khan did and the novelty of that experiments. And because in one of your chapters in your book, you talk about how Islam and Pashtawali are amalgamated to create a very different kind of a configuration to mobilize people and to suggest that there is a possibility to interpret things in a different manner. Now, what really happened to that legacy? That's the first question. Do you find that that legacy, that creative legacy, which was based on some kind of moral principles, were capable of organizing a set of people who were very much divided, who were actually fighting with each other, etc.? So that's the first question. Second question, which actually came out from Rajmohanji's initial remark about the changing image of Pakhtun or the Pathan. It reminds me of a Kabuliwala figure in popular culture in post-colonial India. There is a very famous Tagore story where Kabuliwala comes and things like that. So the figure of Badshah Khan survives not merely in academia, not merely in politics, but there was a popular reception of Badshah Khan as well. In fact, there was a famous Bollywood film called Khudai Khidmatgar where Amitabh Bachchan is called Badshah Khan. So that popular reception is something which was always there. So how do you think that what happened to that popular reception later, say in post 2000s? What happened to that popular reception of the image of Pathan? So these are the two things, and then I open up this, for more specific questions.
Thank you, Hilal. There are so many. You've asked me three big questions. Um, Let me say about Muslim politics briefly, right? There are many more people more qualified to comment than I am, but you're right. I think it is that peculiar alchemy of uh, deep faith in sabr or patience, as Raj Mohanji was saying, that is imbibed from the Quran. But it's not an ideological fight for Islam. It is being inspired by religion as an ethical framework to guide action, right? And it has to be combined with Pukhtun self-making. You've got to be courageous, you've got to be brave, you've got to value defending your honor, and you've got to be Muslim, and you've got to be nonviolent. So it's these three things, these three elements, that's where Islam plays a role. And, he gets into trouble with Maulvis and mullahs all the time. His account has lots of references to what they were telling people and how he had to counter it because of his alliance with the Congress. He was seen to be a Hindu. So he never covered his head after, for most of his life for this reason, because people kept suspecting whether he had turned Hindu and so on. So there were a number of different kinds of fights. And then institutionally, you'll remember in the autobiography, he talks about those early trips long before the Khudai Khidmatgar movement was formed to Deoband. When the Khudai Khidmatgar movement was at the risk of being banned, soon after it was formed, they applied to Muslim political parties and they're turned away. They're told that, sorry, we are actually not anti-British. So we can't support your agenda because you're fighting for independence and that's not our agenda. Then he turns to the Congress. So I think there is, through the Hijrat movement, through the Khilafat movement, there are experiments with dealing with Muslim politics. But then realizing in this practice that ultimately the fight is a much larger political fight in which you have to have a common purpose, which is not a religious one. And here I think, his account of time in the jail, which Imtiaz Saab's translation has so vividly. People should read it just to learn what it was like to be in those British jails. the brutality, the absolute merciless conditions in which political prisoners were kept. But yet the message that he brings out is, this is the first time in my life I even heard anything from the Bhagavad Gita, or this is the first time I could meet people who were not Muslim and learn about their religion. And to my mind, actually, long before he meets Gandhiji or even encounters the Congress proper, it is his encounter with Baba Khadak Singh in Dera Ghazi Khan jail that shows him the power of civil disobedient action, right? Where the prisoners are told, and they're there from the Akali movement, right? They're all in jail, and Bacha Khan lands up, and they're told that you can't wear turbans. And the Sikhs, led by Baba Khadak Singh, say, well, if we can't wear our turbans, we're not going to wear any clothes either. And they take off their clothes. So this is the first demonstration of the political power of civil disobedience protest, which he sees demonstrated. And he has some observations about Sikhism, which I think are some of the most perceptive observations I've ever read by anyone. And, in India today, we're talking about this in March 2021, when we see farmers on the outskirts of Delhi protesting with a civility and a discipline and an inspiration from their scriptures, which is exactly the same spirit that Bacha Khan is talking about, where you're not fighting for a religious cause, but your political action is guided through the ethics of your religion. Now, very briefly, I mean, I did actually write about this in the past on the Pathan figure in popular cinema. And you're absolutely right that if anything, I think Bacha Khan's autobiography, which really everybody ought to read, I hope you will get yourselves a copy, is a overturning of the Kabuliwala figure. The Kabuliwala is hot-headed. He loses his temper. He's very gentle and very loving towards this little girl, Minnie. But ultimately, he is without rationality. And Bacha Khan, and that's the image that has been played with. I mean, even Amitabh Bachchan's character, Khudai in Khudai is a man on a horseback and, much more the stereotype of the Pathan. This is an overturning of that. Now, I'll end with a very funny anecdote about Khudai. When I was in Pakistan, I was traveling all over it used to be called the Northwest Frontier Province, now Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And it was exhausting work. And one day, Habibullah Lala, who used to drive the car, he said, I'll just stop here for a minute and go get something, wait in the car. So I was in the car and sort of nodding off. And I suddenly heard this voice. I'd been traveling everywhere, listening to, collecting stories about Bacha Khan. And I suddenly heard this voice, Main Bacha Khan hoon, in this real baritone. And I just came awake because I thought I was really hallucinating. I was just living and breathing this story. And actually, it was the audio tape of the dialogues from Khudai playing from the local tea stall, because that's as popular as Bombay cinema is in Pakistan as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these stories, and your point about Muslim politics are well taken. So now what I'm going to do is to open this discussion, and instead of asking any one of you to respond, I raise two questions, and then I invite you to respond to those two questions. The first question is, again, this is coming from me as a political scientist. I think the first question is that if you look at the debate between Nehru, Gandhi on the one hand, Badshah Khan and Jinnah on the other hand, it's about modern categories. And the category called state is very important here. Look at the last chapter of the book, where the Federation, where different plans of, where different plans are discussed in relation to India's independence. The main debate is the question of federalism. Do we need a strong state and the provinces will have to follow that? Or do we need a weak state where provinces will have more power, etc.? Now, in a conventional sense of a nation state, both Gandhi and Badshah Khan are actually questioning the whole idea of Western categories and concept in a very significant and practical ways. Now, the outcome, so that's the first question. Can we see at the moment the outcome of those who actually stick to the Western idea of nation state, both in India, Pakistan, and later in Bangladesh, somehow actually created a few very serious problems of life where our specific political requirements are not going to fulfill the demand which are posed by society. So that's the first question. Very briefly, the second question is about the question of language. If we read this autobiography, we find that Bacha Khan is equally critical of the question of Urdu, because for him, mother tongue is mother tongue. And that's why his schools, so the whole idea of Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan, and Muslim Urdu Pakistan is something is also challenged. So this is again coming from the Western concept of nation state. So therefore, these are two quick examples. And do all of you think that the whole idea of imposition of Western categories on us, something has to do, and Badshah Khan's struggle and Gandhi's struggle was something not merely at the level of politics, but also at the level of thinking and intellectual, I would say, Swaraj idea, etc. So please feel free to make any comments and observation on that.
One or two very brief comments. I think that in Bacha Khan's case, his Pathanness, his Pukhtunness was very, very crucial. You can't just think of him as a Muslim figure, which he was. He was a devout Muslim. But he was very much a Pakhtun. And geographically, his area was located, the Indus was a very big element in his horizon, but so was Khyber Pass, so was Afghanistan. So we can't, when we're thinking of other Muslim politics in other parts of the subcontinent, we can't forget the fact that Badshah Khan was very much, he just loved his Pakhtuns. Through the Pukhtuns, he loved all of humanity, but he loved his Pukhtuns very, very deeply. So I think this is something to perhaps appreciate, which also connects to your question about Urdu. He didn't have the natural connection to Urdu that many other Muslims in UP or Bihar, Delhi may have. I think for the moment, I will just stop with this remark.
Mukulika ji?
Just to actually take off from there, the idea of Pukhtunistan, which has come up again with that imposition of a nation-state model, though I think we do also have writing, as you and I know, on the state-nation, which is what India is much more a model of encompassing diversity. So I think the nation-state model of Pukhtuns is very much a second best to the kind of nation that independent India would be without partition in somebody like Bacha Khan's imagination, not out of necessarily a petty rivalry with Jinnah or Muslim League, or, in the way that, sad to say, history has been told. It's not just about petty rivalry, it is about imagining a diverse democratic polity where everybody has more space. And as you said quite rightly, where the location of power is not in the center, that it is in fact more federal, where there is greater autonomy. And with the Mountbatten Plan, that dream is lost. It's not just about India and Pakistan and whether you had partition. It's what kind of polity you were going to create, where if you were going to divide a region on the basis of religion, you are already giving away the idea of a certain diversity that this new polity is going to encompass. So any talk of autonomy for Pashtuns within the new nation of Pakistan is very much a second best option Bacha Khan, certainly. And as Rajmohanji says, it's not just even about the frontier province. It is about the Pukhtuns, and they are on either side of the Durand line, and they had been divided already once in 1894 by the creation of Afghanistan. So this is a repeated, it repeats itself in history more than once.
Yeah, thank you. Imtiaz Sahib?
That Bacha Khan was definitely a Pushtun nationalist. He based his political career and political life on being a Pushtun nationalist within India. That is the point that I have.
Yeah. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us and for making this discussion very fruitful. On behalf of Rolly Books, I thank you. And on behalf of them, I also would like all of you to follow them on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So thank you very much again, and have a nice morning, evening, and Shabba Khair. Assalamu alaikum. Namaskar.